Next, we have an English one. We have William Kilbride. Well, Scottish. Sorry, Scottish. Scottish. Sorry, my apologies. Scottish. Okay, I meant an English speech. William is sinds 2009 directeur van de Digital Preservation Coalition. Dus ik heb zijn voorgangers nog gekend toen ik begon. De Digital Preservation Coalition is een belangrijke organisatie op het gebied van digitale duurzaamheid. Het is al een paar keer langsgekomen, maar het is echt daar wil je bij horen. En net als Marcel komt William oorspronkelijk uit de wereld van de archeologie. En dat heeft hij ook gedoseerd bij de University of Glasgow. Hij was research manager bij de Glasgow Museums. En daarvoor assistant director of the Archaeology Data Service bij de University of York. Voordat hij dus rond 2009 de wereld van digitale duurzaamheid echt binnenkwam. We kennen elkaar dus ruim 10 jaar en soms zaten we in hetzelfde Europese project. Of vermoeid op hetzelfde vliegtuig te wachten. Maar we hebben ook vaak samen op het podium gestaan in een panel of om een presentatie te geven. En zijn organisatie, de DPC, heeft mij in 2018 de Digital Preservation Fellowship Award gegeven. En daar ben ik nog steeds heel erg trots op. William, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Barbara. I'm not entirely sure what you said by way of introduction, so I don't know what you're expecting. But I'm very grateful to you for allowing me to join you today and for your patience as I stumble through my presentation in English. Believe me, it would be much better than me stumbling through my presentation in Dutch, although that may be more entertaining for you. I'm sure it's a pleasure to be invited to reflect today on the question of reuse. And I'm grateful to Barbara for the clever topic which she has already opened up a number of distinctive but not conflicting sets of presentations. So we have all said, and I'm going to add some other different thoughts. But we've spoken on the same topic, but not so much to contradict each other. We've added layers of meaning to this word, reuse. Now, to some this might appear like confusion, but to me, that sounds like collaboration and coalition. And that, it seems to me, is at least where I am happiest. So some of you know, and by way of introduction, I work for the Digital Preservation Coalition. And you'll know as well that Barbara, let me just move on. Barbara was awarded the Digital Preservation Coalition Fellowship last year. And I'll say more about that later, perhaps. But for now, let me simply observe that the ever-changing nature of digital preservation means that the topic is inherently interesting because it constantly changes. But to be honest, it's the coalition part that keeps me coming back. That's the part that I enjoy most. The layers of meaning that we've already introduced today about the word reuse encourages me to concentrate on the people aspect of that question and to take that aspect one step further and to start or to open the discussion a little around the topic of meaning making. Meaning making and meaning remaking are central to the concepts of reuse of digital objects. People make meaning, and with that meaning they make stories, and in that way they remake the world. We remake the world every day. Discursively at least, the scientists have been getting it wrong for so long. The universe wasn't constituted out of primal elements billions of years ago. The universe is constituted and reconstituted every morning when we get up and we tell ourselves these stories. So this short paper will examine the concept of reuse from the perspective of how people make digital resources meaningful. And I'm going to delve here into the concept of the designated community, a term which puts users and their ambitions for reuse at the heart of the digital preservation project. Or at least it seems to put them there. We'll get to that. Let's start by making our own story. How did we get here? Well, digital preservation, Marcel's touched on this, and Barbara too. Digital preservation has emerged as a community over the last 2 or 3 decades, mostly by borrowing, that is to say, reusing concepts from many other disciplines and professions. Digital preservation is the practical expression of the duty and the capacity and the resolve to address a global, generational challenge to provide consistent and authentic meaning making. It's a specific kind of hybrid digital practice that has emerged in this community, but which is ubiquitously relevant. The shared concepts, typically codified from practice into standards, provide a common vocabulary across this diverse group, which might now be termed a community of practice. But good practice from one sector might not be good practice in another. So even within a creative community, tensions and subtle differences are certain to arise. And sometimes assumptions are encoded and transmitted as standards which appear neutral, but which transplant and inflict values from one sector to another. And that might not always be in our interests. Collaboration is a social good. But beware of geeks bearing gifts. Here's just one example, and some of you know me already and know which direction I'm going to go here. So I'm going to talk for a moment about this. Show of hands. Anyone in the room ever seen this diagram? Anyone in this room ever drawn this diagram on a blank sheet of paper? Or perhaps as a tattoo on their arm? The OA... Was that a yes? Did I get... We'll talk about that later as well. The OAIS reference model is adopted from Space Sciences, the Consultative Committee for Space Data Systems. Hold that thought in mind. And it makes particular assumptions about the users, that's to say the consumers, to use the vocabulary, of a digital archive. And it includes a special class of consumers, which it calls the designated community. So I'm going to come back to that thought, so hold on to that. Here's our first linguistic horror. I'm going to talk about reuse and reusers, but I think the OAIS model would have us talk about reconsumption and reconsumers. Yuck. But that's beside the point. Let's cycle around the idea of the designated community for a moment. And this is the OAIS functional model that everyone recognises. And in some sense, this is the community of practice of digital preservation. But connoisseurs, Barbara among them, will tell you that we shouldn't be making tattoos of the... I mean, it's not healthy to make tattoos of the functional model. Imagine, in fact, what we should be doing is making tattoos of the information model. That's the one that really matters. Imagine the horror of getting the functional model tattooed onto your arm, only to discover subsequently that it should have been the information model that you asked for. So let's take a look at that. Here we go. Anyone recognise that? Another show of hands. Anyone seen this before? That's got a cheer. That guy actually got a whoop. Well done. On first inspection, there's a problem written into the information model. So let me walk you through it. In order to render a digital object meaningful, a vast array of semantic and structural information is packaged alongside it. And we call that representation information. And you can see that somewhere, if I can make this work. Well, you can see it on the, on the slide. It can't be trusted with lasers. So, the representation information is interpreted with representation information. And so we risk a sort of infinite recursion. So let me play that out to overstate the point as usual. In order to understand a bit stream from a database, we need to understand the format of the database. Are you with me? Say yes, William. And we need to certainly understand the relations in the database and the declared meanings of the fields in the database, and perhaps the constraints on data entry, and the many concepts of relational database design. And perhaps we need to understand the vocabulary of database design, and perhaps the metaphors or idioms which that vocabulary exploits, and the language which contextualizes those idioms, and how the person who entered the data understood that language, and the changes in the language through time, and the glyphs which render the language and render that language into text, and so on. Very quickly, a single data object requires the whole of human experience in order to be rendered meaningful. Think for a moment of the effort which NASA had to put into the Voyager gold discs in order that intelligences millions of light years away and millions of miles and millions of years away would need in order that they could access and understand the disc. This is not sustainable. And of course, it's not what happens in practice. We have two routes out of this. Firstly, representation information can link to other representation information. There's actually a box called Other Representation Information. So you only need to explain the PDF format once, and there, but for the grace of God, go I. More importantly, the OAIS places information packages into an active exchange where there is already a significant degree of implicit knowledge, which there isn't for the Voyager disks. So, the infinite recursion stops where the user's knowledge is brought to bear. And that is the designated community, a class of users whose needs define the limit of representation information. A class of users, therefore, who define in practical terms the nature of the preservation actions and provide the only independently verifiable measure of success in digital preservation. Now, this definition makes sense to me in the context of information sharing in research. So as Barbara has introduced me, my background is in archaeology. And by the way, you work in archaeology, a warm, dry job indoors is all you can hope for from a career, especially in Scotland. I got one of those warm, dry jobs indoors, and I worked for the Archaeology Data Service, which is a data centre for archaeological data. And a great setup it is too. And when we provided data through the Archaeology Data Service, we knew who our users were. There are about 1,000 of them in the UK who can use that data. It's a very distinct, very clearly defined, designated community that we could speak to on a day-to-day basis. And that makes sense to me, therefore, in the context of archaeological research or other types of research data. But it seems not to work for me in other contexts, because it creates a sense of entitlement and, by extension, a sense of exclusion for the reuse of digital materials by the greater mass of the population. And this seems at odds to me with the wider movements towards inclusion, contested meaning, and polyvocality, which have come to prominence in archival theory. And I reference you to the IPRES keynote address by Michelle Caswell, for example, as a discussion of that. Now, one might quite reasonably claim that archivists and librarians have always been the gatekeepers to knowledge, and that this will always be the case. And moreover, in practical cases, many practical cases, the OAIS sees the curator as the special class of user, acting as a broker to access. But we're all plugged in and powered up now, where an immediacy is valued over authenticity, and disintermediation is the norm. So it seems to me that the designated community is a marvellously arcane idea. Now, there are reasons why an archivist or curator would need to retain some kind of intellectual control over what is made accessible, data protection, copyright to enforce those, not to mention the very real need for sensitive records to remain confidential to their clients. But even before we reach those requirements, we've already raised a barrier of our own. To recap, who gets to make, who gets to remake meaning in a digital archive? As currently constituted, this seems like a privilege enjoyed by a few. So a strange conclusion. It's true to say that OAIS holds reuse at its very heart, And on this basis, it's fair to assume that users are at the core of digital preservation activities generally. But it's a very special group of reusers that are envisaged, with a very special type of reuse that is in mind. And this is probably not the access that the world expects from us. I think this is what the world expects from us in the context of digital preservation. Note, effortless and user-focused. Now, I've dwelt too long on this topic. I really don't mean to excavate the foundations of digital preservation. I simply want to observe that there are values hiding here that need to be explored, and which are a practical barrier to reuse at scale. And this particular barrier to reuse has emerged from the way that the digital preservation community itself has constituted its actions through time. These sorts of mismatch emerge in part from an obvious but too poorly documented dynamic of the digital preservation community. It's a large and rapidly growing community, which is becoming more diverse through time. There's a sidebar here about our own experiences of growing up in digital preservation. For example, I think I'm right in saying, Marcel, where are you, that we first met in 2000 at a conference called, excitingly, what was it called? Something like Metadata 2000. That just sounded so exciting at the time. It was the same event at which the DPC was willed into existence. And at the time, it seemed like the entire global digital preservation community was in the room. There was not quite 100 people. In 2020, the DPC has almost 100 members. So the digital preservation community is no longer a special niche interest. This dynamism is welcome. And as I said at the start, it's actually the bit that keeps me coming. And I think Marcel was hinting that we've been poor at reusing and reimagining our own practice. Well, why is that? We can point at least to some extent to a lack of infrastructure, a rapid growth of the sector, and a rapidly changing set of requirements. My real question is, can we avoid these kinds of mismatch and misunderstanding in the long run? And that's the very obvious purpose of collaboration. And with no subtlety at all, it allows me to point to the work of the DPC and all the other forums that you would expect in which partnership and collaboration allow that kind of multilateral conversation. And of course, collaboration is what Barbara, through her work at the KB, is best known for. Not only what you have achieved, but how you have achieved it. And by the way, let me observe, for the avoidance of doubt, at least in Scotland, we are still very keen on the idea of maintaining and expanding multilateral conversations. And we're beginning to see the value in disintermediation too. But enough about exit. Digital preservation is now surely mature enough to set some expectations about how to engage with each other more effectively. And this is where I turn all that how-to introspection into a call for arms. We're good at this. We've suddenly all alighted on calls for arms. Reuse. Making meaning. Remaking meaning should be at the core of digital preservation. And whether we realise it or not, the OAIS information model puts reuse into all those service architectures and workflows. It's just not terribly obvious. Now, one way to progress this would be to put reuse at the core of our digital preservation research and development too. That way, an honest and transparent assessment will emerge where we can all learn better from each other and not just from those successes. Perhaps, if we get used to the idea of sharing and reusing the digital objects we create, then we'll come to a better appreciation of the many reuse cases for the digital objects we also curate. As far as reuse is concerned, putting users first puts all of us first. So a call to arms. We should preserve the story of preservation. That will help us in two ways. It will demonstrate to our audience that we are capable and willing to eat our own dog food, to take seriously the requirements we impose on them. And it will remind us, as a constant case study, of just how hard and just how rewarding meaning making can be. We will understand our own goals experientially. We are the people who own the Digital Preservation Challenge. We have the task of making sure reuse and reusers are at the core of the purpose and practice of digital preservation now and in the future. It's not a question of thinking of users first, or thinking about technology first, or thinking about research goals first. If we work that way, we'll all keep coming second, each as an afterthought to someone else's purpose. All of us should come first, all of the time.